My review of the day is about what I think is an absolutely marvellous book. This is Slan by A E van Voght. This is a book that I've been reading since my early teens. This particular edition is one I've owned for all of my reading life, virtually. It was published in 1975, but I probably got my hands on it a couple of years after that. It's one of the very few books I managed to get as a teenager that was new, and I've taken care of it because that cover. How gorgeous is that cover? Anyway, every reader of fantasy and science fiction that I know has got certain books and certain authors in their mind that are the reason they got into the genre, and they will always remember those books, those authors fondly, even if they haven't read them for a long time, even if they don't stand up to the test of time. They still really, really enjoy those books and those authors. For me, Slan, the book, is one of those books. It is, well, I'll describe what the story's about later. But while Slan, the book, is one of those books, A E van Voght isn't necessarily one of those authors. I have read other short stories by him, and I have read other books by him, but not recently. So a couple of days ago, and it's my last review, I'll post it down below perhaps. My most recent review was The War Against the Rule. It wasn't a bad book. It was a good classic sci-fi book, but it wasn't great. 3 stars out of 5 is the most I'd be able to give that one. And reading that, I wondered if perhaps Slan wasn't as good a book as I remembered either. Perhaps it was my childhood memory, thinking what a wonderful book it was. So I had to read it again, and I read it fast. I gulped it down. I think this is a marvellous book. This is 7 out of 5 stars. I still find it as intriguing, as nicely written, as enjoyable as 11 or 12-year-old Deb or whoever it was first read it. There's a few things about it that I want to mention first. This older edition doesn't have an ISBN. I'm guessing it was before they were obligatory. It does have a foreword by Sam Moskowitz, who I think that's an author, I'm not sure. And that is, since its first appearance in magazine form in 1940, Slan has become virtually a legend, and in book form, a rarity. There you go, I own a rarity. Now A E van Voght has somewhat revised his story, and it is once again available to the many fans who have searched for it. Slan is Van Vogt's most famous and perhaps his finest story. It is fine. It is a beautiful story. Some of my complaints about The War Against the Rule don't hold true for this one, and some of them do hold true but don't matter. So in The War Against the Rule, we didn't have a lot of descriptive power being dedicated to scenes, and I mentioned that that's one of the things that A E van Voght as an author was criticised for. But the scene description in Slan is marvellous. The characters are a bit wooden, but there are a lot more of them than there were in the previous book I read, and every single one of them is distinct. They may not have a huge emotive depth or a huge amount of emotional relatability, I suppose you'd say, but they are distinct, good characters, and for at least 2 or 3 of them, the lack of depth of character makes sense given who they are and what they're doing in life. So Slan starts off with an 11-year-old, 11? No, he's 9-year-old Johnny Cross, who is being brought into the city on his birthday by his mother. Johnny is a true Slan, and all he knows about that is that it's a mutation of humanity that has included a whole heap of physical characteristics that mean they're faster, they're stronger, they're more acutely intelligent, they're better at learning and stuff, and they have these 2 golden tendrils that rise from the front of their hair, which allow them to use telepathy. They can use telepathy on other telepathic Slans, but they can pick up the thoughts of normal humans. So Slan is basically a post-dystopian, in a sense, master race, evolutionary, next mutation in evolutionary mankind type story. I think it's pretty subtly done. The post-apocalyptic thing is that when Slans evolved, or were created at the beginning of the novel, you don't know which. There was a huge war between them and mankind that ended up in a period of dissolution. A lot of technology was lost. A lot of the technology that was lost was attributed to Slan's inventions, and a lot more to the war. So there was a human Slan war. No one knows quite how long it occurred for, but it's left a human civilization that is global and controlled by one man called Keir Grey from... Keir Grey? I think it's Keir Grey. Anyway. Yeah, Keir Grey. From a palace in a city. We're never really given a description of which city or which part of Earth this would have been. I think we can assume America. Maybe an American would recognize the location of the city and the river, but I've got a feeling that Van Vogt intentionally made it nebulous, not in any particular location. And I think he did that a lot when he used Earth settings for future stories. Anyhow, the humans are violently against Slans, and they've got a secret police part of the government that is responsible for killing Slans and hunting them down. Jommy's mother has dared to bring him into the city because there's a certain number of Slan secrets she wants her son to know about. She and Jommy already lost Jommy's father some years back. He had been uncovered by secret police and was murdered. He hadn't fought to save himself, even though, as a scientist, he had the most amazing weapons at his disposal. Now, Jommy's mother's sort of grooming him for when he becomes an adult, which among Slans is the age of 15. He will then take over his father's discoveries and go on to... I don't quite know what the goal is. Rehabilitate Slans? Not eradicate humans, but anyway. So that's the timeline. Jommy's mother is discovered. She's killed. He grows up hiding in a slum with an old rag dealer woman, protecting him, but only so much, as long as he brings her money. And then when he becomes mature, he goes and gets his father's secret from its hiding place in the catacombs under the city. And that's Jommy's story as he then grows into adulthood and he starts searching increasingly desperately for the true Slans. He discovers in the process that there's tendrilless Slans, ones that are Slans, but they don't have the telepathic abilities, and they don't have the tendrils. He then finds out to his shock that they hate and loathe true Slans as much as humans do, and they tried to kill him when they discovered he was one. Now, side by side with Johnny's story, we also learn about Kathleen Layton. She is a true Slan girl. She's being brought up in the palace, which is the seat of government, and she's being brought out under the protection of Keir Grey, who's the leader of the entire world. His chief of Slan hunters, John Petty, is desperate to slaughter her. He wants her out of the palace. He wants her dead. And so there's this ongoing tension as she tries to survive. Keir Grey protects her. John Petty is trying to get rid of her. In that already, we've got two main characters that are interesting and distinct and aside from each other, and a whole sheaf of interesting side characters, each of which is distinct. So it's very enjoyable. The way Van Vogt also describes the palace, which was evolved using Slan technology to be almost a living crystal building, is also beautiful. The descriptive powers in here are marvellous. The story has a couple of blips that I noticed in this reading but had never noticed before. There's a couple of places later on Jommy and Kathleen encounter each other briefly before she's killed, and in that sequence they suddenly blip from one place to another, so that they are in these underground caverns that were built by true Slans as a hideout, but how they got there isn't mentioned because the paragraph ago they were standing on the ground level. Weird things like that. There's not a lot of them though, and overall I think the writing here is magnificent. It's thoroughly enjoyable. There was... So in the foreword forward. Apparently, this book was actually started as a series of magazine articles. It's been brought together beautifully. Until I reread the foreword this time, I hadn't remembered that it had ever been articles. It reads like a single narrative. It reads like a single, fairly smooth narrative. There's a couple of time gaps between when Jommy's really young and Jommy and Kathleen in their two separate stories are quite young, about 15 or 16, and then it jumps ahead to when they're about 20 or 21. But that doesn't feel artificial. It doesn't feel like a new story all of its own. It feels like a continuation. This book also scores high in terms of the science part of science fiction. There's actually quite a lot of it. Jommy's father had been an experimenter and he'd discovered uses of a non-atomic electron power. I don't know how else to describe it, but it goes into some detail about how it works. Not being a physicist, I can't tell if it's accurate or not, but it's pretty detailed and it's impressive. There's also a lot that goes into the description of how slans evolved, and I'll mention some of that even though it's kind of a spoiler. It was published in 1975, it can't be that much of a spoiler. So Jommy's understanding were that slans were a natural mutation that arose. When he comes out into civilization, as it were, away from his mother, he starts finding out that the humans claim that slans were artificially evolved using a mutation machine that a particular man, Samuel Lan, after which the slans are named, he was using it on innocent women to produce mutations in their babies, and many of those mutations were harmful, but the ones that weren't evolved were the slans. Jommy completely rejects this theory to begin with because his understanding of slans is that they're good people, they're noble, they are kind-hearted even towards humans, which are not very kind-hearted toward them. They're non-violent, a whole heap of the best of humanity, as it were. He also grew up sharing his mind with his mother, but hadn't encountered any other true slans. So he experiences a lot of emotional turmoil when he starts hearing this lie as he sees it being told, but then he encounters this tendril of slans. They believe the same thing. So Jommy's got this real identity crisis, if you will, between what he believes and what he knows and what he thinks is true and what other people think and believe. And he evolves into a very harsh, maybe hardened, grown up, which is the A E van Voght style of man, but here it makes sense. Jommy's hardness is explained in the circumstances in which he's growing up and what's happening to him. So I don't mind it here at all. I think it works very well. So the idea behind Samuel Lan, we find later in the book, was he had no machine at all, and he hadn't caused mutations, but he discovered the mutations when they were arising, and there was a consistency. So that brings us back to biological science. I'm not saying that Van Vogt's notions on how mutations in bioscience and species evolve are true, or even very likely, but at least he uses biology and evolutionary theory to propose a theory of how the next step of human evolution, as he sees it, arose. He's describing a jump of evolutionary process where all of a sudden a mutation causes a whole new next step of evolution, as opposed to a gradual mutation and evolution through natural selection. But at least he's doing science there. That's real science, and it's a really, really good book. I think I'm going to step away from A E van Voght now, because I think after this one, nothing else is really going to be as good. I'm going to move on to another author for a while, and I'm going to leave you with that cover, because how beautiful is that cover? If I could get a copy of that cover, I'd be hanging it on the wall behind me. It's that beautiful. Anyway, if you haven't read Slan but you like classic science fiction, I suggest you read it and comment, all that sort of thing. Please comment.